Hello, all. Welcome to the sixth episode of the Axis of Resistance initiative. As initially been promised, today you are going to watch our sixth episode on the Lebanon. This panel has been recorded on August 19, and I have the opportunity and pleasure of hosting two esteemed guests. My first guest is Mrs. Mona Yacoubian. Mrs. Yacoubian is the director and senior advisor of the Center for the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She has more than 30 years of experience working on the Middle East and North Africa, with a focus on conflict analysis, governance and stabilization challenges, and conflict prevention. She was previously Vice President of the Middle East and North Africa Center at the U.S. Institute for Peace, where she managed field programs in Iraq, Libya, and Tunisia, as well as Washington, D.C. based staff. In 2019, she served as an executive director of the congressionally appointed Syria Study Group. From 2014 to 2017, Yacoubian served as Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Middle East Bureau at the U.S. Agency for the International Development, where she had responsibility for programming across Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq. She earned a Master in Public Administration from Harvard University's Kennedy School of the Government and a Bachelor in Public Policy from the Duke University. Yacoubian was Fulbright Scholar in Syria, where she studied Arabic at the University of Damascus from 1985 to 1986. Our second guest is Mrs. Joanne Held Cummings. Mrs. Cummings is a retired Foreign Service Officer from the United States State Department with multiple awards. She served in a variety of the leadership positions in the embassies from Yemen to missionaries. And she was most recently the POLAD to the Combined Joint Task Force against the ISIS from 2018 to 2020. In her role as a United States foreign officer, Ms. Cummings led U.S. diplomatic missions, political and economical units, and served as an advisor to senior military commanders in Iraq, Afghanistan, and in the broader Middle East. She led the U.S. humanitarian programs on displacement in Iraq. Prior to the State Department, Ms. Cummings advised institutions across the Middle East on education and development through offshore companies in Cyprus. Thank you very much for being here. I know earlier this week you had the surgery. It was very nice of you to still attend and not change the schedule. So thank you. Once again, I want to welcome you. And today we are going to discuss with the Lebanon, which is quite timely while we are recording this episode on August 19, and we are going to stream it in a week from now. God knows how many things happens in the middle, but already so many things has happened. The first thing is that the primary actor of the Lebanese politics in the last 4 decades seems no longer is fit to be the primary actor, the Hezbollah. The second change of event is that the primarily regional country who used to make an influence on Lebanese domestic politics, Iran, is also seeming to lose its footprint. The geopolitics of region has changed. As you know, the Syrian government, which was the land bridge to the Lebanon between Iran and Lebanon, is no longer the picture. The Shia militias across the region are under attack. The Israelis seems to be on offense today. They seems to be quite determined to do what they call rolling back Iranians' fire circle or circle of fire. And I think that makes our event timely. But before going forward to what happens today and what would happen in the coming months and coming weeks, which I know is an impossible task to anticipate, I want to go a little bit further in the past to the history. And that's why I want to ask you, Mrs. Yacoubian, you're an expert of Middle East, you're an expert of also, U.S., you both are U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East. The first question that I want to ask you is that historically speaking, since the World War II, since the emergence of the United States as the global 9/11 or superpower, where did Lebanon stand in U.S. foreign policy, and specifically in U.S. Middle East policy?
Well, I think I would look at Lebanon's role, I think, particularly for this conversation, as a place particularly of interest after 9/11, when there was a strong focus on countering terrorism, and Hezbollah, as you noted in the introduction, really throughout the 2000s, having the once it was initiated, having the preponderance of force on the ground. And I think we saw distinctly after 9/11 a focus on Lebanon as an arena where Iran was projecting its regional influence through Hezbollah, which in many ways was considered the crown jewel of Iran's various partners and proxies in the region. And so I think this is what drew a lot of U.S. interest in Lebanon. I think it's important, though, if we're talking historically, to go back to when Hezbollah was really first created in the early 80s. It emerged following Israel's invasion of Lebanon. We saw, of course, Iran capitalizing on the emergence of this Shia-driven resistance force, Iran investing in arming and financing the group, and over time, Hezbollah really growing to be perhaps one of the most, if not the most, powerful military force on the ground in Lebanon, usurping the government's role as the sovereign, though it was a non-state actor. And so I think this is what really drew U.S. attention to Hezbollah, to Lebanon. And we saw, therefore, a variety of ways in which the United States sought to counter Hezbollah and by proxy to counter Iran's influence in Lebanon. We saw the U.S. take a number of measures, coercive measures, from even at times kinetic action, certainly in the early 80s, following, for example, the Hezbollah's bombing of the U.S. Embassy in the Marine barracks, or its purported role in that, to other coercive measures, designating Hezbollah as a terrorist group, enforcing a variety of sanctions against Hezbollah. And in addition, the second approach that the U.S. took was one of bolstering a state counterweight to Hezbollah. And this, I think, we saw principally through support for the Lebanese Armed Forces, or the LAF, as it is known. And those have really been the two ways in which I think we've seen the U.S. Engaging to counter Hezbollah and, by extension, Iran's influence in Lebanon.
Thank you, Mona. I mean, before going to Joanne, I don't want to lose momentum, so I have a quick follow-up questions. You mentioned that Hezbollah been around since 1980s, and I believe that you're referring to the deployment of the division of Mohammad Rasulullah, Iran's IRGC, to Syria, and through that to the Lebanon. But correct me if I'm wrong, but after 9/11, it got to be more and more on the U.S. radar, and I think the 2006 war had something to do with it.
Exactly. Sorry.
Sorry, but the questions that I have, and please don't forget your point, is it seems when it comes to the Middle East militias, and those of them who are specifically targeting American interests, United States didn't, and I'm talking about the historical context, not today, I'm asking about the historical context, didn't treat Hezbollah as it treated the Sunni militias. For instance, the Al-Qaeda and ISIS receiving much harsher response from the United States. But in an event of the Hezbollah, even after the attacks in Beirut, it seems U.S. has been trying to avoid kind of a direct confrontation with the Hezbollah. And they were not shy about it when it comes to the Al-Qaeda or Taliban. What was the difference? And please also share the point that you had and I interrupted it.
Well, again, I think you rightly point to 9/11 as this critical turning point where the U.S. did indeed focus, for obvious reasons, on Sunni jihadist terrorists such as Al-Qaeda. That being said, it did also, in a way, lump Hezbollah, though it was a Shiite terrorist group, in with that broader focus on countering terrorism. I think the critical moment, and you touched on it, was after Israel's war with Lebanon, Israel's war with Hezbollah in 2006, in the summer of 2006. And I think that sort of really elevated the threat Hezbollah posed, or the ways in which the U.S. viewed Hezbollah. But you're also right that the U.S. had a clear, first of all, was very much engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan, not interested in expanding its kinetic action to Lebanon, but rather countering Hezbollah by building up a counterweight to it. And again, this was really the focus of building and deepening the Lebanese state institutions, principally the Lebanese armed forces. And so we saw, beginning in 2007, a real spike in U.S. assistance to the Lebanese armed forces, trying to build it up as a counterweight to Hezbollah. So early on, maybe before 2006, support might have been in the single-digit millions. It skyrocketed and ended up being somewhere in the realm of I think 200 million at a point, in support of Hezbollah, in support of the Lebanese armed forces. And so you see a different strategy with respect to countering Hezbollah and by extension Iranian influence in Lebanon, which is one of both, again, building up a counterweight through the Lebanese armed forces and then adopting coercive measures, principally sanctions, but not engaging in direct military intervention.
Very good. Thank you, Mona. And, mentioning of the creation of the Hezbollah and militias activity, Joanne, I had a questions for you, and that's, Hezbollah is not the first, as we all know, is not the first Shia militias in the Lebanon. Prior to Hezbollah, we had the Amal movement, which was also interestingly an Iranian creature, but before the Islamic Revolution of 1979, it was mostly being funded by the exiled member of Iranian opposition to Shah, including Imam Musa Sadr and Mustafa Chamran. It was a Shia militia, and after the revolution of the Iran shifted its attention to the Hezbollah. And for a brief area, actually, there was a conflict between these two militias, between Amalis and the Hezbollahs. Hezbollah being supported by Iran and Amal movement by Syria's Hafez Assad. But they are not the only militias in the Lebanon. We used to have the Christian Marounis, or the Phalanges armed groups, which they kind of triggered the Syrian civil war to some extent, the Lebanese civil war of the 1980s to some extent. We also have the Palestinian groups who PLO mostly camps who were there. We have the Daruzes militias, the Sunnis militias, which kind of makes me always wonder, what is it about the middle Lebanon itself, specifically speaking, that makes it such a suitable target or environment for the growth of militias? I mean, if you look at the history of the Syria or Iraq, let's say that from the 1948 that these countries gained their independence, they had unrest, they have various coups, but none of them being like Lebanon, a place that the militias just grows in it out of nowhere and stays there for decades. What is it about the Lebanon that makes it so vulnerable to such activities?
I love this question because I actually have an entire lecture that I give to my students. I promise I will not do that. Part of my background is that I went to Lebanon when I was 2 years old, and I graduated from university there. I was in and out. I went to high school in Iran, and so I was in different parts of the region. But Lebanon, in many ways, is precisely configured to have disparate groups that may be armed in relation to each other. And that's the important context. This is not something that is necessarily new. Part of it, and I am not a geographic determinist, even though I am a geographer, but we do have a lot of physical differentiation in the country. We have mountains, we have valleys, we have coasts, we have all sorts of ways that people can sort of go to their part. And historically, groups have come to Lebanon, have gone to the mountains to have their own place. And so there's a rivalry, a jockeying for control. But places on the coast like Beirut were in some ways where everyone came together, but everyone still knew where they were from in the mountains or in the valleys or in the south. So it is not surprising that Lebanon has had a history of civil conflict, civil wars, long before 1975, because the structure of the country, and then of course after World War II and after the French Mandate, the structure of the government, in order to ensure that everyone had a piece of the pie, also meant that people wanted to expand or protect their own piece of the pie. at the beginning of the civil war in Syria, so I was in Lebanon when the civil war began. I was in Syria when the civil war began. Please don't blame them on me. But the tensions at that time were as much within groups, among Maronite clans, between Shia groups, as they were, in some way, a strict and definable ethno-sectarian split. When you look at Syria, when the civil war started, many Syrians were not terribly concerned that there would be a civil war, because they said directly to me, Syrians don't do civil wars. We're not like Lebanon. We're not like Iraq. We don't do civil wars. And to an extent, that's true. And you can argue about whether it has something to do with, a greater territory within which those smaller conflicts could be subsumed or not. But Lebanon has had tensions, armed tensions over who can dominate which important areas for several hundred years. I say that as background because I don't want us to look at right now as being, this is something Iran is doing. Mm-hmm. This is something that Iran is taking advantage of, but it was there.
Wow, thank you. A very close friend of mine is a Lebanese, Armenian Lebanese, a Christian Lebanese immigrant. He came here 45 years ago. And, I asked him once this question, and he said, by no means he's a political or international affairs analyst, but he said something very interesting. He said that there are two things about Lebanon that attracts everyone. It's very beautiful. I said, okay. And it's the smallest piece of the Middle East. So if you want to start anything, you easily can start and get away with it there in the region. That was his interpretation. Well, I appreciate your articulate response. And I want to get back to you, Mona, and we continue our discussions on Lebanon and the United States foreign policy. In 2006, when the 34 days war happened, I think that was the time that Hezbollah kind of flagged itself. It was the first time, although the Iranian and Hezbollah's propaganda tried to portray the Hezbollah as the winner of the war, but I really don't recall, given to the damage, that they were winner or victorious. Even Hassan Nasrallah later on said that if he knew how would the damage would be because of the war, he wouldn't invade it or cause the hostage crisis. But it was the first militia that stand against the Israel and kind of got the chance to fight back to some extent. And that's where the Hezbollah arose in the Middle East in terms of popularity, propaganda, and also political function. And as you very articulately cited, that United States had preoccupation elsewhere in the Iraq, in the Afghanistan, and I think it's noteworthy for audience that 2006 was a very critical area for the United States for two primary reasons. Because first, we were witnessing a kind of Taliban's comeback. It was the beginning of the Taliban's. After 2004, they started to have the comeback, and 2006 also is a very chaotic time in Iraq. So, in defense of President Bush, maybe one can make an argument that the last thing that he wanted was another conflict. But whatever the reason was, that Hezbollah raised and established itself as a prominent actor. From there to the Syrian civil war era, 2011, Hezbollah's activity is very covert outside of Lebanon. They are active, but they are covert. For instance, in Iraq, they are assisting the Shia militias, they are training the Shia militias, but they are trying to be covert. Even they had some activities in Egypt and also Bahrain for conversion and things like that, but they were covert. And it seems that the Americans, as you said, that continue the indirect approach to it. But the questions that I have for you, and it's a kind of a hard questions, if we go back in that time, do you think there was a momentum that U.S. foreign policy lost to to counter Hezbollah, to neutralize Hezbollah? Was there anything that they could have done?
I mean, that's a speculative question. And I think the first thing I want to say, which goes back to the original question you asked, and I neglected to say it, but I hope it's obvious to the audience, which is, look, the U.S. was focused on Sunni jihadists and al-Qaeda because, of course, that was the group that attacked the United States on 9/11. And so that was understandably and rightly the primary focus. We could get into all kinds of debates about going into Iraq and the strategic miscalculation there, et cetera. But I do think that's important to underscore. I think, your question is a really interesting one. And I think, to me, it speaks to kind of the underlying dynamics, the unseen dynamics that maybe give rise to the growing power and influence of Hezbollah, which very much was taking place at that time. Certainly, yes, it suffered losses in 2006, but you're absolutely right that it was able to rebuild. And in some ways, there was almost like a folk hero-esque quality to Nasrallah as the head of Hezbollah, facing the Israelis, fighting the Israelis directly, etc. I think the U.S. perhaps didn't well understand the dynamics at play inside Lebanon, a Lebanon that has also always been characterized by a weak state government. And so Hezbollah, I think, exploited that weak central government and was building really essentially what could be called a state within a state, servicing the Shia community in Lebanon and deepening its influence, I think, in ways that the United States did not fully understand or appreciate. And here I would raise the example of what happened in 2008 when the U.S., together with its allies, the Lebanese government of Prime Minister Fouad Siniora, and what was at that time called the March 14th movement, which harkens back to the assassination of Rafiq Hariri on February 14, 2005, and the protests and so forth that eventually led to the pushing out of Syria's physical occupation of Lebanon. But the U.S. and together with really the Siniora government pushed and applied a lot of pressure on Hezbollah at that time, seeking to shut down its telecommunications network, to fire the security chief at the airport, which was under Hezbollah's control. And Hezbollah, I think, lashed out and ended up actually, in a way, following this brief takeover of West Beirut in 2008, a time when Hezbollah turned its arms, supposedly for the resistance, on fellow Lebanese. This really was, I think, a moment of understanding just how powerful Hezbollah had become. And in fact, it emerged even more powerful after the intercession of the Qataris and their mediation and what came to be called the Doha Agreement, which in essence accrued more power to Hezbollah. And so I raise that as an example to say, I don't know that the U.S. could have blunted Hezbollah's influence. I think that would have required a much, much deeper, much more, intuitive understanding of all of the dynamics at play in Lebanon at that time, and a deeper understanding of what were the influences that gave rise to this kinds of power that Hezbollah accrued. What we do know, last point, and I'm sorry to be going on, is we did see Hezbollah, I think, frankly, alarmed by the civil war that was beginning to kick off in Syria, and alarmed by the prospect of Sunnis in power in Damascus. And so we saw first covertly and then overtly Hezbollah's intervention in Syria to help prop up the Assad regime, certainly in concert with Iran, but I think very much because for Hezbollah, the prospect of a Sunni jihadist government in Damascus for them was also considered an existential threat. And I think that has echoes even today, which we could perhaps talk about in a little bit.
Thank you, Mona. I very much appreciate the point on the Hezbollah's takeover in Lebanon and being the state within the state. I think that's one of the things that we barely talk about it out there, because Hezbollah is not only a military wing. Actually, at least used to be a large administration. They had the largest banking system in Lebanon, the Hassan al-Gharad, which is a so-called charity. They own the largest amount of gold reserve in Lebanon. They are the top creditor actually in Lebanon. They make the most loans in Lebanon and get interest relatively even lower than the Lebanese bank. We have to wait and see. They run the airport for a long time and the telecommunication. And I think in 2006 and 2007, you know better than me, Hezbollah reached a stage and a status quo that wasn't the party who formed Lebanese government, but was the party who could have vetoed the formation of the government. I think that's one way of the pulling. But I have one more follow-up question. I hope you wouldn't mind. We do understand about the United States and its concerns, its prioritization, and as you said, we can get into a long conversation if it was a wrong one or right one. That's a different topic. But the United States wasn't the only actor that was perceived threat by the Hezbollah. There were three main fronts in the Middle East that didn't see the rise of the Hezbollah as a suitable event for them: Americans, Israelis, and the Arab states. Well, Israelis took action in 2006, which I don't think so it helped them in the long run, at least. The Americans had their own priorities. But you're a Middle East expert, and I want to ask you about the inactivity of the Arab states, specifically speaking Transjordan and Arab states of the Persian Gulf. It seems that while they had the political backlashes against the Hezbollah, verbally they were keen to attack it on and off, or financially they supported some of the opponents of the Hezbollah, but they never tried to materialize it. And even at some point, the whole idea of deployment of Arab army or formation of Arab army came up and it vanished very quickly. What was the obstacle for the Arab states who were very keen, not shy, to state or declare Hezbollah as a threat, but also not taking any decisive action by themselves? They are wealthy, they are resourceful, they have militaries, but try to stand off any direct confrontation.
I just don't think that was ever in the cards. I mean, we've never seen joint Arab military action directed into another Arab state. I mean, I'm thinking about Saddam's invasion of Kuwait and the ways in which way back when there was a broad coalition mobilized. But I don't think that was ever the MO, if you will, of the Arab Gulf states. Instead, we saw what we saw, which was a propping up and a support for this March 14th alliance, strong support by the Saudis in particular, and a desire to blunt Hezbollah's influence, albeit indirectly. And often, I think, especially as we got deeper into the 2000s, 2009, 2010, we saw calls by Arab Gulf states in particular for the U.S. to take the lead in, cutting the head of the snake, so-called, and going after Iran directly. We've evolved significantly from there, but I just don't think it was ever really a live prospect or in the realm of how those states operated to engage militarily. I think they had lots of financing, lots of ways to exert influence, and they did so by supporting various allies in places like Lebanon as a counter to Hezbollah and by extension Iran, much in the same way that the U.S. did.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And Joanne, Mona mentions about the Hezbollah's, the impact of the 2006 war on Hezbollah, and the fact that Hezbollah kind of got the chance to portray or establish a successful or at least effective propaganda. I believe in 2007 there was or 2006, one of these two, right after the war, there was a polling in Arab world, specifically speaking Egypt, and Hassan Nasrallah, the former leader of the Hezbollah, was among the top 3 popular leaders. One thing that I would like to ask you, and you've been a person who had a first-hand experience, you've been in Lebanon, you follow Lebanon as event. I I don't think so that Hezbollah got its political standing only through military means. I don't think so that was just them fighting was uh, what they got them popular for, at least to some a portion of this Lebanese base, to some for some area for some time. When it comes to the Hezbollah, the argument is very complicated. That people usually mention that Hezbollah has a different side. It's been a provider of the service to the Lebanese. Some people making even a little bit of dramatic or emotional argument. They argue that the Lebanese Shias used to be the less privileged part of the Lebanon's society. They were the bottom class. After the rise of the Hezbollah, the demography changed. And at least I think from 2006 to 2022, I'd say that the Shias were one of the main actors in Lebanon. But what I would like to ask you is that behind the military scene, how Hezbollah got the chance to place itself and settle itself in a Lebanon's and broader, in regions, a political landscape. What they did, what was the approach they took?
That's an excellent question, because yes, there are questions of sect, but there are also questions of Arab versus Persian identity. There's a question of regional status within Lebanon. We already talked about Lebanon a little bit. And since you touched on that, I will say that one of the major factors in the first half of the identity of Lebanon was that the Sunni, who tended to dominate the coast, and the Maronites, who tended to dominate the mountains in the north and were favored by the French, the Shia seriously felt themselves to be disadvantaged, to be actively underdeveloped. So there was a deep sense of frustration. I think that is, sometimes people would say, well, that's part of being Shia. But in the case of Lebanon, it's also a regional identity. But putting that on the side for just a moment, Iran had to overcome, whether it was Iran under the Shah, Iran under Ayatollah Khomeini, and the Khamenei had to overcome a distance between Arab and Persian identity that goes back before the time of Islam. So if Iran wants to position itself as a large regional player, which it has done under various governments, then it needs to find a way to link itself to what Arab groups care about. Because then it can say, we are on your side. Don't look at us as Persians, look at us as being on your side. Now, Hezbollah is interesting because of the various groups that Iran tends to give a lot of support to right now, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis. It is one that has an ideological link from early on, but in terms of its role in Lebanon, it's not just that it is an extremist terrorist group that runs some schools. It is a regional government that has schools and clinics and the rest. I have been in Hezbollah schools. They are schools that could be anywhere in the United States. As a matter of fact, they use American textbooks to teach reading and, interestingly, to teach critical thinking. But people in the region do not support them because they are rocketing Israel. They support them because they are an effective local government. Now, if you are a government, even if you're a non-state actor, if you're a government at that scale, then you tend to have actual geopolitical concerns. And that links over to the role of Hezbollah in Syria. And I saw Syrian army trucks early on with Syrian flags and with Hezbollah flags side by side going out against the protesters. this was kind of a critical issue for Hezbollah because they had come to the point where in both Lebanon and sort of in the region, they had a geopolitical role, even though they were not formally a state, but they had popular support, as you said, including in Egypt, because they were resistance and they were standing firm and they were fighting for the underdog, except manifestly in Syria, they were fighting for the overdog. And there was a big hit to their reputation among people who kind of liked Hezbollah because they were, they were fighting for the oppressed when they were taking the side of the oppressor. And I think that their work in Lebanon now has been complicated by this sense of identity. And when I believe it's Larijani came to Lebanon, and he's presenting Iran as the resistance, not Iran, not you want to be friends with Iran, but you want to be friends with the resistance. The resistance is on your side. So you see this playing out again.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for, touching, Mona did it earlier too, but touching on a Hezbollah civil war, because it makes my job easier. I can go with the next section. In 2011, the Syrian civil war outbroke because of political unrest, and Syria is dealing with 4 years of drought, which I think people don't get much of a credit to it too. But and as you both mentioned, the Hezbollah made a decision from the early on that they need to fight the good fight for the sake of Assad's regime, which is quite an interesting story because, for the audience of ours that who are not really aware of that, Hezbollah's relationship with the Assad family is one of the love and hate kind of a situation, as Hafez Assad was quite tough on them. Syrian soldiers even opened fire on Hezbollah's militias various times in Lebanon, but during the Bashar chain, things changed. And you mentioned that, Mona, that Hezbollah seen the Sunni uprising primarily in Syria as an existential threat. And I think it matches as the Hezbollah's operational modus operandi in Lebanon. Because the first offensive operation they had, it was in Ghonaitere, which was a connecting city in the southern Syria to the Lebanon. And then they focused on Al-Qalamun region and, clearing the border. And after that, they actually went to the death. If from 2011, 2013, they were really focusing on South, and then they go forward. But by 2014 and 15, Hezbollah is kind of widespread among the Syria. And in 2016 and 17, they actually reach a newer stage, and they now having the collaborations. In 2016 to 17, they actually formed a joint command room or communication room with the Russians, according to the reports in Lazaria. And Americans were watching this. Americans were watching the rise. I think that was a stage that the Shia militia was in action across the region. I mean, there was a regional front that they were fighting across the region. But the United States seems to once again, and correct me if I'm wrong, to prioritize the Sunni jihadism, which was ISIS at the time, rather than fighting the Hezbollah, which is a sound reason behind of that. The threat that ISIS was projecting against humanity in general was much larger. But it happened, and Syria and Hezbollah grows in Syria. But after that, and I hate to analyze, compare everything with the World War II, but I usually do. It seems that we see a similarity between Hezbollah and the Germany World War II in a way that when they reach their peak, they start their downfall. The Hezbollah's downfall, many make an argument, starts in Syria. And because they exposed themselves, they were on larger scale operation. The Israelis were getting a better intel on them. They also were getting hit by the Israelis. They lost a good number of the commanders and troops. One thing that I want to ask you is that Hezbollah's intervention in Syria, while it was to counter an existential threat, what impact had on Hezbollah's functionality, operational capacity in a long run?
Well, let me first start. I mean, the decision by the U.S. to go after ISIS and not the Assad regime, when forces are coming, U.S. proxies filtering into Syria, will they go toward Damascus or will they go to the east? Again, this was a controversial decision. I think at the time there was some that felt the U.S. needed to focus on going after and regime change in Damascus. But again, it's not just that ISIS was a threat to humanity. ISIS had captured U.S. hostages, was slitting the throats of U.S. American citizens on film and so forth. So again, it is a threat directly to the U.S. and also, I think, a transnational threat that ISIS posed. I don't know that I can offer you. I'm not steeped in the details of Hezbollah's operational capabilities and what they gained or whether they stretched themselves too thin by operating in Syria. I mean, there are different schools of thought on that, and there's certainly the idea that Hezbollah became battle hardened through operations in Syria. Yes, absolutely, they were targets for intelligence gathering by the Israelis, by the U.S. and others. And maybe that's what led to the exposure that they had that then led to ultimately Israel's very successful attacks on the group starting in mid-September of last year. But I'm not so sure that I would agree with the analogy you raise with World War II Germany. I mean, I think in some ways, let's not forget that Russia played a key role in propping up the Assad regime through its massive air power. Let's not forget the episodes of barrel bombing, etc. And there was a period of time in Syria where the regime was clawing back territory and it had gone fairly far from opposition elements in Syria, so that at a point the regime was back across all of the western spine of Syria with the exception of Idlib. And perhaps I think the feeling was for Hezbollah, it had extended itself significantly, and then as the regime is clawing back territory and operating with Russia and to a lesser extent Iran and other Iranian militias, by the way, on the ground in Syria, that it could go back and perhaps reconsolidate its control in Lebanon. But, I don't know, Joanne might have a thought on this, but I think it's a little more of a nuanced picture, I guess, is how I would put it with respect to the impacts of Hezbollah's interventions in Syria.
You're absolutely right. I think there is no doubt that the Russians played a key role. The Institute for a Study of the War has a map of the Syrian civil war. And if you look at the map on the September of the 2015, prior to September, when Russia launched the operation, Assad regime is controlling 17% of its territory. By 2018, when the Russians stated that the major offensive operation be ended, Assad now were controlled about 75% of the territory. So goes from 1/5 to almost 2/3 of the country. And there is no deniability. But I would like, as you pointed out, to go to the Joanne, and I appreciate her point on it and what she can share with us.
Absolutely. And Mona, I think you made excellent points, and it is extremely complex, obviously, both in Lebanon and in Syria. The timeline of what happened in Syria is especially important because, yes, Russia had been supportive of the Assads since the time of the Soviet Union, partly to have access to territory, partly because it was a continuing purchaser of Russian arms. But the decision of the United States to not do much beyond communication support when the opposition was rising against Assad, I am perfectly happy to be critical of that decision. I was at the embassy at the time, and if you want me to be critical of that, I will do it. We could talk about the reasons in DC why that happened, but the problem of fighting ISIS then was that there was a political decision in DC that we were not going to take lethal action. We were not going to take military action, supply weapons to fight against Assad. We were not going to do direct, overt regime change, but we needed to support someone who was going to be able to fight ISIS. So we had to find a group that was not in the opposition to Assad. So the what became the Syrian Democratic Forces in northeast Syria was the group of choice. So we have to recognize that group had not joined the opposition. There are Kurds who were in the opposition. There were Kurds who were not in the opposition. There were tensions among these groups. Now that Assad has fallen, we have throughout the country a lot of reconfiguration of groups. And part of that relates to Hezbollah in kind of a complicated way. What we've seen in the last 2 weeks is tensions and fightings and killings in Sueda that have involved Druze and have involved Arab Bedouin, and both sides claim that the other one's at fault. The Israelis took military action, not just there, but in Damascus, saying that it's on behalf of the Druze. They have also supported the SDF, the Kurds who are in northeast Syria. And there are people in Israel who are talking about it would be good to have a corridor between the Druze and northeast Syria. Now, this is something that would serve really only Israel, and is a challenge on the ground, whether it is in Lebanon or in Syria, because when groups are seen as linked to Israel, this can create tensions and hostility toward them. So you get a vicious cycle, because then there are attacks, and Israel could say, look, they are against you, so you have to be on our side. Hezbollah stands to gain from that. The more Israel appears to be unilaterally seeking to claim territory or to start fights, the more Hezbollah is able to say, yes, indeed, we have to stand firm in the opposition. So it complicates things in a very, very circular way. But I think we should not forget that that dynamic is in place.
Thank you, Joanne. If you don't mind, I have a quick follow-up questions. You mentioned
Sure.
you can talk about the discussions and reasons in DC why this decision been made. I assume you're touching on the domestic matters. Is there any chance that you can briefly, walk us through it?
Well, Mono probably can as well. There were people in the embassy and domestically who were saying, we need to take a stand against Assad. We have been saying for years that he's a terrible person, that this regime is terrible. These are people who are seeking democracy. Look at the protests. You have Alawis and Christians going out with Sunnis. This is a good thing. We should take action. But you had people also saying in Congress, well, we don't really know who would take over. It might be somebody worse. We're concerned about where this would go. We don't like Assad, but it might be somebody else. President Obama made the decision not to say, we're going to do this. He said, we're going to throw it to Congress, and Congress could not agree. I think that there are political reasons why he did that. I am disappointed in that, not because I am someone who advocates the United States doing regime change. However, what Assad did was to deliberately seek out, kill, imprison, exile those people who would be seen as positive, popular, productive alternatives. So the longer the Civil War went on, the more we had the opposition groups turning into militias that in many cases had problematic histories, had taken actions that people were uncomfortable with. We can talk about Shara if you want to. With Shara, I would point out that he actually led a region for a period of several years, and I would rather take that action as an examination of what he's likely to do, which I think is fairly positive. But he is coming into a very, very difficult situation that the Russians, the Iranians, and some groups inside the country would still like to see fail.
Thank you, Joanne. And I appreciate the touch on the recent developments, which brings me to the question that I have with Mona. Mona, Middle East is many things, as you know, but there is one thing that Middle East is never going to be, and that's boring. Since October 2023, we have a new, to some extent, we have a rising in regional order, or at least collapsing the previous one. We have the Hamas terrorist attack on the Hezbollah. We have the fall of Assad's regime in December of 2024. And then we have the Israelis, Lebanese, Hezbollah's conflict, following by the Iranian wall, but specifically speaking, the removal of the Hezbollah's chain of command. How did all these developments, specifically speaking, because since we are focusing on Lebanon, Israel's decapitulation of the Hezbollah's leadership, its attack on the Hezbollah, Israel has, it seems, taken about 1/3 of the Hezbollah's arsenal, almost the entire first generational member of the high command. How all of these make an impact on U.S. foreign policy, specifically speaking toward Lebanon? Is there any chance that these are going to make U.S. more, I don't want to say courageous, but tempt the United States to make bold actions in the region?
Well, I think you're seeing the U.S. Fairly engaged right now in Lebanon. In fact, Ambassador Barak and the Deputy Envoy Morgan Ortagus were in Beirut yesterday. And there has been pretty significant shuttle diplomacy conducted by Tom Barak in the name of actually seizing on what many would say is an unparalleled opportunity to put Lebanon on a more stable trajectory for the Lebanese government to reassert its control over Lebanese sovereignty, which really was almost non-existent at the height of Hezbollah's power in Lebanon. The decimation of Hezbollah, as you describe, has, in the eyes of many, opened up real possibilities to put the country on a more stable footing. The current topic right now, the current focus is on disarming Hezbollah, or as the government prefers, reasserting its monopoly over the state, over weapons across the country. And so, I mean, I think the U.S., at this point, I think this level of engagement is important. It's commendable. I hope that it is sustained. But I also think it's really important that it be calibrated with an astute reading of the dynamics on the ground. Again, going back to that episode that I raised earlier in May of 2008, when I think there was a bit of a miscalculation as to how much power and influence Hezbollah had at that time. I think it's clear that Hezbollah is in a much weakened state today. It no longer has control over the airport, as an example. Certainly, it has lost much, if not all, of its top senior leadership. Areas, Shia-dominated areas in the south have been really, and by the words of some, annihilated because of the very intense Israeli strikes. But it's really important to proceed, I think, in a smart way, in which the U.S. plays a role in helping, in shepherding this process. The Lebanese government has, as of a couple of weeks ago, asserted its willingness, its objective of proceeding with the American plan, which would include disarmament of Hezbollah, and they've even set, a deadline of the by the end of this year, the end of 2025. Now, how we get from here to there is a whole nother question, and I think that's where continued and sustained U.S. diplomacy on several questions that will no doubt come up is going to be essential.
Thank you. I would like to ask you ask that question, and I'm going to ask it. But before that, I have a question for Joanne. Joanne, Mona outlines the external pressure on the Hezbollah, and also internally speaking from the Lebanese government. And I think that, as she said, that the evidence are very clear. The evidence that even Iranians are losing their influence is very clear. Mr. Larijani, as you earlier mentioned, was in Lebanon this week, and the Lebanese foreign ministry didn't even met him. He is the General Secretary of Iran's Supreme Council of National Security. The foreign minister of Lebanon stated that they didn't have time, but if they even had the time, they wouldn't met. So I think that in a Middle Eastern culture, that says a lot. But I have a question for you. Hezbollah went through a lot: the war, the fall of a key ally, Assad, and the death of, let's say, one of the most charismatic leaders that it could have had, Nasrallah. The questions that I have for you: do you think Hezbollah can recover from all of this? And how all of this made an impact on Hezbollah? And second, can Hezbollah recover from this?
A couple of different responses to that.
Yeah.
Hezbollah is definitely in a different position. And if Hassan Nasrallah had not been killed, then we would be looking at, can he recover both his own status and the status of the organization? He's not. So it's a different issue. Earlier on, I said that unlike some of the other groups that Iran supports, there is an element of ideological resonance between the current government of Iran and Hezbollah. Much less true in the other groups. The question then is whether the indigenous motivation for Hezbollah, in other words, not ideological linkage to Iran, but the core economic and political issues, the status of the Shia, the relative development of southern Iran, southern Lebanon, the incursions and bombings by Israel, those don't require ideological linkage with Iran. So the question is both whether the leadership of Hezbollah can recreate an organization that Iran would see as, yea, verily, this is our organization. But secondly, whether an organization must exist because people are going to, in a sense, call it into being. I think that would be a better option, because in that case, the Lebanese government has a much easier time saying, okay, what is it that you need in order to feel that you are being taken care of and you do not need to create a militia? So if I were the Lebanese government, I would be leaning forward very, very hard to say, let's just take away all those cover stories about we're here to protect the Shia. Let's give the Shia what they want. Let's support people in the South. And let's create an agreement that there is going to be a state with a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. So I think that that would be a good option. But the United States is in a slightly difficult position here in terms of what it's advocating, because in Lebanon, absolutely wants there to be one source. In Iraq, we want there to be one source. We want the PMF to be explicitly and effectively folded into state control. In Syria, I mean, Syria is saying that that's what they're doing. They've had meetings with other countries, including Israel, about doing that. But there are some people that are saying, well, no, this group and that group should have autonomy and they should be able to maintain their own militias. So we could do what the United States has done in the past and say consistency is not something that we're particularly concerned about, or we could try and find a way to rationalize this across these various countries.
Thank you, Joanne. I thank you for the subtle, policy suggestions, because it gets us to the final questions. But I have a quick question for Mona, and then we go from there. Mona, you mentioned that there is a deadline for the Lebanese government to incorporate, to disarm Hezbollah, or let's say that to reach the monopoly of legitimate violence, as Max Weber says. So, do you think is it doable with the U.S. if the U.S. backs it? And do you think the U.S. backs such a deadline?
Well, I do think the U.S. backs the deadline, and I think we've seen some interesting statements even yesterday by the envoy, special envoy Barak, commending Lebanon for the progress that's being made, and actually in this case calling on Israel to also maybe step up a bit and do its part. We can talk about that. Is it doable? I don't know. I mean, I think that is the $64 million question. And I think there are all kinds of variables at play here as to whether or not it is doable and how it's doable. And so I think it's going to be incumbent. We know that Hezbollah, of course, is rejecting this out of hand. And even, last Friday, Naim Qassem, the now head of Hezbollah, raising the specter of civil war in Lebanon. The real question is kind of how this is done, and a lot of it is, some of it has already started to happen, certainly south of the Litani River, but across the country into the Bekaa and other areas, that's going to be another question, and much of it is going to be contingent on, once again, this question of the Lebanese armed forces being built up, having its capacity and its bandwidth expanded such that it can play that role, it can fill in, particularly in the south. And here I think it is going to be important, the question of sequencing and providing assistance and support to the Lebanese armed forces now, as opposed to saying disarm completely first and then the assistance will come. I think the assistance is an essential piece of that equation. Building up and extending the capabilities of the Lebanese armed forces is going to be a critical element. Beyond that, questions of how this is messaged. And I think this issue of the Shia community feeling besieged, feeling vulnerable, I think, it's important to pay close attention to that. What kinds of livelihoods opportunities will there be? What kinds of economic development will there be in southern Lebanon? It is, as I said, it's been devastated over the past year or so of conflict with Israel. There is no USAID anymore. I think it would have been a fascinating and important opportunity for organizations like USAID to step in and fill that vacuum of social services, of economic development in particular. So I think, the question is an open one. I wouldn't pretend to have the answer. I think we are in a very, very important moment right now, though, in the country's history, a very delicate moment, and pursuing this objective smartly, with our ears to the ground, with deep understanding of what's happening in the country, and being strategic and thoughtful about the best way to do it. I think that will be critical.
Thank you, Mona. Thank you for the policy suggestion. I have a quick clarification question, and then we go to Joanne's and her policy. So you are suggesting that the idea or approach of making a quid pro quo, that the Lebanon receive assistance after being disarming Hezbollah, or let's say that the decapitating Hezbollah's position, is not the correct approach. The assistance, the Lebanese government requires the assistance in order to be able to do so.
I think there needs to be a calibration in place. Yes, I think there needs to be a continuing support for the Lebanese armed forces as it fills in and takes additional positions in the south and as it strengthens. Yes, I think trying to push for abrupt, immediate disarmament could really be a recipe for provoking, civil unrest, widespread instability in Lebanon. We've seen it before. Hezbollah is down, but they're definitely not out. And so understanding what that equation looks like is going to be very, very important in order to be successful.
Thank you, Mona. Thank you very much. And Joanne, to you, you hit it on the policy suggestion, but if I want you to outline a suggestion and approach toward the U.S. and how the U.S. should, address the situation in Lebanon.
We've talked a little bit about the areas of support that the United States has and could provide to Lebanon. And I agree with Mona entirely that, this is exactly where we should have USAID. This is a prime example of how devastating it is to U.S. policy to have dissolved USAID and to be gutting the Department of State. And I'm also going to add destroying USIP. So thank you, Mona, for everything you did there. The challenges in Lebanon are partly because over many, many decades, the United States has dealt with different parts, physical parts of Lebanon, but different parts functionally of the Lebanese government through different mechanisms of the American government. Even within support for the security services, we have had support coming from different parts of the U.S. military to different parts of the Lebanese military, which is not a bad idea if you want to say, well, let's focus on building relationships. Then we're not constantly sending in new people. That all makes sense. But it can mean, even though it's all U.S. government and in a perfect world would have exactly the same approach, it actually doesn't. So if you have special operations funds going to special operations people and big army funds going to big army people, but those groups in Lebanon tend to be commanded and staffed by slightly different populations, then we're developing linkages that can be seen as divisive. I mean, we have the FBI dealing with justice things. We have Treasury dealing with banks. We have lots of different groups establishing relationships, doing the best they can. I'm not criticizing any of them, but it does not necessarily form a structure that is conducive to the kind of unification and coherence and stability that we would want to see in a Lebanese government moving forward. I'm not saying that that's something we need to change, but I do think it is something we need to put on very, very clear glasses and recognize what we're doing so that we can have those meetings in DC and everyone can say, okay, what are we trying to achieve? Unfortunately, this may not be an administration that is very open to that happening. So, I'm glad that Mona is talking about what Tom Barak has been doing, and I think that there are some very good areas that he and Morgan are working on. But in terms of having clear, well-informed national approaches, I'm afraid that this is not the time that we're going to see them. So I think we need to put that in our bags as something that we need to draw on when the time is right. The other thing is that Lebanon doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is next to Syria, it's next to Turkey, it's next to Israel, it's almost next to Jordan. Each of those have extremely important issues going on inside their countries, with neighboring countries, and with the United States. So we cannot simply talk about what's going on in Lebanon without recognizing what the dynamics are, partly because they always affect what the decisions being made in DC are going to be, but partly because if we're not looking at those, we're going to be blindsided by some of the actions and policies that are developed by people in the Lebanese government.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And while I'm grateful to both of our esteemed guests and the privilege that they gave us with their attendance, I also want to thank our audience. Thank you for being with us for another episode of Axis of Resistance Initiative. And I would like to ask you to continue your support by being watchful of our new and upcoming episodes. In September, we are actually going to have a busy month. We are going to have 2 episodes in September, one in the second week of September, which is going to be a follow-up episode on Lebanon, and the other one on the last week of September, which is going to be the last country panel that we are going to have in this initiative. This is going to be on Yemen. So please stay tuned. It's not the end of us. You will continue to hear from us, and thank you. I appreciate it.